Now, most of you instinctively probably think it's knight f6, but this allows a beautiful checkmate. This was the 1620 game, GH, knight h5 and bishop g6 mate, which, by the way, is a very common pattern in many openings. Like this mate on the h5 e8 diagonal, I can give you a million examples. Okay, guys, let's get started. This will be a quick one. Welcome to those watching on YouTube to another edition of the Speedrun. Hope you've been enjoying the different time controls. Let's do a 10-minute game. This might be a somewhat shorter episode. Let's see if we can get an instructive game or two in. Okay, let's do this. We have black here. 1g3 is the move that we're facing. Now, this move in and of itself is basically the reverse modern, and we're facing potentially another hippo. It's pretty crazy how many of these hippos we've faced in the early going of the speedrun. I don't know why the double fianchetto is so popular, but it's definitely not an opening to be feared. And at this point, if you're watching the speedrun diligently, the move should basically come automatically. So we start by grabbing control of the center, and the setup that I advocate starts with the move bishop to d6. The key kind of autopilot move that you should refrain from if you want to play my setup is knight to c6, because I'm advocating putting a pawn on c6 in order to blunt the king's bishop. And we, of course, do the same thing from the white side when we're facing the hippo. Remember that these types of openings are, so my recommendations are symmetrical. You can do this with black, you can do this with white. So we start with bishop to d6. So I'm anticipating bishop g2. Okay, f4. I was actually going to point this move out as a move that perhaps some of you might be somewhat worried about, and certainly should not be. Now, there's two ways that we could try to meet this move. We can try to refute it tactically, and we can play very positionally, very practically. We're going to choose the second option. Now, this type of idea, as I'll show you after the game, is very well known from the Owens defense. And the Owens defense is when white plays e4, black plays b6. White typically plays d4, black plays bishop b7, and the main move there is bishop d3. And in that position, f5 is a very old line that is refuted. So this type of idea can be a little bit scary. So here we can play e takes f4, bishop takes g7, f takes g3, and go into the complications. But those complications are hard to evaluate. We're going to have to sacrifice a rook and play for checkmate. So maybe it's winning for black, maybe it's not. But why would we bother with those complications when there is a very simple response to this move that doesn't entail taking any risk? And that's the move knight c6. Now, you might say, but didn't I just say that the setup I advocate for involves the move c6? Well, f4 changes everything, right? This type of flexibility is pretty important. f4 is an extremely weakening move. And the top priority for us right now is to make sure that the e5 pawn is well protected. So we can throw our old setup into the trash can. White is playing something completely different. So now, again, we have a very pleasant choice. f6 is a totally viable move. In fact, I really, really like f6. The other option is to play queen e7 and protect the pawn of the queen. But I actually really like the look of f6, which I know is kind of heresy if you are familiar with the Feingold aphorism, never play f6, and it might look very ugly. It might look ugly and kind of anti-positional to play this move. Here you might be a little bit concerned that you're weakening the king, but all of that is going to become a moot point because you have to be concrete when you're assessing the pros and cons of a move like f6. And if we try to look a little bit into the future, what's very likely to happen right now, we were threatening to take on f4, right? Because we blunted that. We basically did the same thing on this side that I was originally planning to do on the other side, building this little pawn chain. So white trades on e5. Now we take back with the pawn, vacating the f6 square for our knight. And after we castle kingside, not a single shred will remain of the old weaknesses, right? So yeah, the move f6 weakens our king as long as it remains in the center. But given how passive white's setup is, given the fact that none of white's pieces are even in the remote vicinity of our kingside, there's just nothing to worry about. We're going to castle, and we're going to achieve kind of the ideal setup. d4. White continues to poke and prod at our center, and this is, I would say, close to a losing move. The reason I say that is because it creates even more weaknesses in white's camp. So white has completely yielded control of the center. we've got amazing development, and now white creates massive weaknesses in his territory and blunts his own bishops. So what is the sort of standard response to this move? Of course, it's to push e4. And the main weakness that I'm looking at is this e3 square. That square, and maybe a pawn will land on that square, it doesn't change the underlying weakness, is going to be weak for the rest of the game. And we have very easy potential access to that square by jumping into g4 with our knight. So starting with e4 makes a lot of sense because now this bishop on g2 is sitting duck. It's completely out of the game. We have this ideal pawn chain built up. And the other bishop is also kind of out of the game. And knight h4 is just total collapse by our opponent. This blunders a piece to a kind of idea that I talked about at length in a previous speedrun episode. I'm pretty sure we had this type of concept before. There's nothing wrong with the move knight to g4 here. In fact, it probably does do the job. But there is a much simpler way to win. The knight is trapped. The bishop controls the f5 square, and we can sneak in the move g5. Notice that if white had already castled, then g5 would have been ineffective due to the knight jump to f5. So very important to be concrete here when you're evaluating this move. Yeah, now white is busted. White is down a piece. Will I still castle? Well, that's a good question. It depends entirely on how white chooses to fight here. If white castles kingside, we might not even need to castle. We might be able to play for checkmate on the king side while keeping the king in the center. I'm not excluding the possibility that we castle kingside and sort of tuck the king away in the corner on h8. And if I were playing white here and I was trying to generate the most practical chances, I'd probably push c4, which is a type of idea that you should be very familiar with, right? Anytime there's a pawn chain, the ideal way to fight it is by attacking the base of the pawn chain. Nimzovich kind of outlined this concept in his book, My System, very famous sort of early primer on positional chess. But it's kind of an intuitive concept, right? And it's applicable to any other topic. Like if you want to make a structure collapse, you want to eliminate the foundation. So attacking this pawn on d5 would be ideal. But white does castle. First of all, we pick up the knight. And okay, so this is exactly what I expected. Because white's taken on h4, and you might be kind of buzzing with ideas here. Already, some of you might be advocating for or screaming for the Greek gift sacrifice. And in reality, many roads lead to Rome here. We can do this without any sacrifices, or we can do this in a flashy manner. I suppose this is a good chance to spotlight like a very basic execution of the Greek gift sacrifice, because I think it's just the best move. Yeah, bishop h2. And we're going to do this without the need for castling. I mean, this is flashy, but it's functional. It's flashy, but it wins the game. And there's not much to calculate here. There really is not much to calculate here. We haven't had a Greek gift sacrifice just yet, but I'm assuming that most people watching this are familiar with this concept. If you're not, I won't dedicate like a ton of time in this particular video to outline the basics. Just do a Google search. There's some YouTube videos on it. So if you're totally unfamiliar with the Greek gift, you just saw an instance of it. It's basically a pattern, a tactical pattern that arises when you have these three ingredients. You have a bishop that's aiming at h2, again, or h7 if you're playing white. You have a knight that can jump into g4, and then step 3 involves activating the queen via h4. So this particular construction is very typical in the Greek gift sacrifice, but it's much more complicated than people realize. People think the Greek gift is always cut and dry. In reality, you could have a Greek gift sacrifice that leads to very unclear complications, and I'll show you like a sneak preview of what that could look like. Okay. So here, obviously, queen h2 is the winning move, and we're just picking off all of white's pieces. We could win the queen. We could win. It just doesn't even matter. We could start by taking the rook. It's going to be checkmate in just a couple moves. Okay, so now I think the fastest way to mate is to push e3. I talked about this in the last speedrun episode. When you want to optimize and deliver checkmate as efficiently as possible, first of all, you want to block off the escape square from the king. All right, so your instinct might be to go queen f2, but my instinct is to immediately identify which direction the king is going to run. So the moment you realize, the king can only escape through d2, the move e3 becomes very natural. Okay, queen d3, there's mate like this. Okay, so this was a simple game. There isn't too much to talk about. I don't want to kind of belabor obvious points. I do want to give you kind of a background into this kind of tactical idea, as well as a little theoretical bonus. So let's flip the board for a second, because this is actually important. If you're an e4 player, you need to know this. In this position, which we've had already, black can kind of play the hippo with g6, right? And now we can go back to the setup that I recommend with knight f3 and c3. Black can play the move e6, which is the kind of main line of the Owen's defense. And here, again, my recommendation is to play knight f3, and there's its own theory. That's a separate question. But there's an old move here that a lot of people don't know, which goes f5, and it's the same idea. But here, white wins essentially by force. I'm actually going to pull up a file that I have on this and give you some notes. So here you're actually supposed to play e takes f5. And white is winning if black plays bishop takes g2. Technically, I believe that the best move for black is to kind of backpedal and go knight f6. But obviously, black's position is just borderline hopeless because you're never getting your bishop out without crippling your pawn structure further. Nobody who plays f5 will do this kind of thing. Okay, here we go. So, yeah, bishop takes g2. So to give you some context, this position first occurred in the year 1620. So one of the first earliest recorded games featured this variation. That's why I said it's an old line. White checks on h5. And the game is not as over as you might think it is. So you might see g6, fg and think that everything is cut and dry, but it's actually not. Black has a very clever defensive move here. Well, sort of defensive move. Who knows what it is? If you're watching on YouTube, see if you can pause and figure out how black survives here for more than one more move. Now, most of you instinctively probably think it's knight f6, but this allows a beautiful checkmate. This was the 1620 game, gh, knight h5, and bishop g6 mate, which, by the way, is a very common pattern in many openings. Like this mate on the h5, e8 diagonal, I can give you a million examples with both colors. For instance, this opening against the bird's opening, called the Fromm's Gambit, features a trap like this, where black plays the move g5. This is a bad move, but it works against inexperienced players who unsuspectingly keep developing. And if you want to impress your friends, obviously, you can play bishop g3, but you can even play queen g3. So that's one example. Another example is in the Dutch d4 f5. White has this sneaky sideline bishop g5, actually a very good line. And if black plays h6, you retreat to h4. And again, the unsuspecting player will just pick up the bishop with g5, bishop g3, f4, and meet with the move e3. At least I think this is the right move order. Here maybe black has e5, but in this position you can play e3. In this position you can play e3. And obviously if black takes the bishop, then you have queen h5 mate. So not to belabor the point, but this is just a theme that you should be aware of in many openings, this mate, early mate on this diagonal. But the correct move is bishop to g7. And the point is that after g takes h7, king f8, it's not entirely clear how white continues the attack. And if you take the knight, which is actually not the best move, this is the thing to remember, then after king takes g8, the position is actually unclear because you are going to lose your rook in the corner, and there's no way to checkmate the black king. The best move here is knight g1 to h3. You simply have to remember this if you're an e4 player. And the point is very clear. It's almost never played, this move knight h3, but it wins the game. The point is that you want to deploy the knight to g5. You don't care about black's knight at all. Now, black has really only one way to defend the mate, which is knight h6. If black plays queen e8, then you take and deliver mate on h7, or win the queen with mate. So black has to play knight h6 in this position. And now, the second point, which also you have to remember, at this point, black is completely paralyzed. So you simply develop your queen side. You go knight c3, bishop d2, and you castle queenside. And eventually, this rook on a1 is going to join the attack via g1. And even though black is up a rook, black is completely and utterly paralyzed, which is really cool, actually. I only see one game in the database with this line where black played the move e6. The important thing to remember is that if black tries to push your queen away, you go bishop g6. And there's a beautiful detail here. If black goes back to d8, who can spot an incredible tactical sequence that essentially leads to mate. And yeah, this is a bit of a detour, but I don't think anybody will, regret knowing this. It's an incredible construction. Queen takes h6 is the correct move. Just in the interest of time, I want to get another game in, so I'm going to show you knight e6 and bishop h6 mate. I mean, where do you see this kind of mate on move 14? Gorgeous. So the one game in the database continued e6, and here you simply continue developing with bishop d2. So for example, let's say that black develops knight c6, you castle queenside. Now you're threatening to pick up the bishop, so most people would drop the bishop back. Now the rook gets involved, so you basically pre-move these 4 moves, 1, 2, 3, 4. And once the rook gets involved, black is completely busted. For instance, let's say the queen gets involved in the defense. Now you eliminate the bishop and simply drop the knight back to f3, opening the g file for the rook and preparing to infiltrate via g6. That's it. Black is completely helpless. Knight f7, rook g6 is in my file. Queen drops back, and it's time to deliver the final blow. Knight f3 to h4. Notice how the knight was redeployed, right? It was on g5. Now it moves into h4, and eventually we're trying to access g6. And if black plays knight takes d4, then we win the game with rook takes bishop, queen drops back, and black loses absolutely everything, for instance, the queen. Yeah, that's just one of many lines, but you can explore this further on your own with the chess.com engine or Lichess engine. The big thing to remember is in the Owens defense, you actually can and should take this pawn. And then the big 2 things, right? Knight h3, do not take that pawn, go knight h3. And the second thing is, once this position is reached, you just slowly, quietly develop your queenside and get the rook into the attack via rook g1. So that's the rundown. Now, if we compare this to what we got in the game, here it's a slightly different situation. Maybe we can play e takes f4. I'll check with the engine. Maybe this is still possible. I don't rule that out. Let's see. So we had g3, e5, b3, d5, bishop b2, bishop d6, f4, e takes f4. Yeah, here it's much less obvious. So the engine gives equality because here white has actually the move h4, preventing the queen from entering the attack, and now the rook is going to be lost. So it gets really, really messy here. So my intuition was correct. Here we simply sidestep everything with knight c6 and blunt the bishop with the move f6, basically forcing white to release the tension and giving our knight this very nice natural developing square on f6. So white is already in pretty big trouble positionally, but d4 makes things even worse. Probably white should have castled, we would have castled, and it's not entirely clear how white completes their development because d3 is unthinkable. It, again, creates this massive weakness on e3. So probably our opponent would play something like this, but you can kind of see where this is going. Now we're threatening e4. We can play queen d7 and bishop h3. White's position is just passive and really crappy, and we control the center. So white plays d4, we respond to e4, and after knight h4, g5, the game is over. Probably knight e5 was the most resilient move. And what would be your reaction to the move knight e5? What would you propose here for black? Last point before we move to the next game. Let's see what people in the chat are saying. Yeah, just castle. So I'm really happy to see that because I was expecting a lot of people to say, yeah, well, we should take the knight and go knight g4. But why would you give up your excellent dark squared bishop to try to, trick your opponent? Because your opponent's going to protect this square. He's going to go queen d2. And it would be very short-sighted to then grab the pawn. Yeah, black is probably better even here. But suddenly, white's got the bishop here. Your king is stuck in the center. And white's pieces are a lot more active than they were. So simply castle. And if white also castles, then you can just start chasing this knight out of e5 with a move like queen to e7. This is the simplest approach. I would even recommend queen e8. I think this is the deeper move because after the trade, the queen can be deployed through h5, kind of Grand Prix attack style. And then the pieces are just converging on white's king. This is essentially game over, I think. And of course, the pawn structure on the queen side is not something that you care about. In fact, it's actually really, really good that we got this pawn to c6 because now c4 loses all effectiveness and we can just ignore it and bring the queen to h5. After knight h4, g5, we win the piece. It's only move 9, but I think the rest is very obvious. We had this Greek gift sacrifice, so I'm going to take a rain check on delving more deeply into the Greek gift. I'm sure we'll get another chance to do that. My recommendation for newer players watching on YouTube and is just to do a quick YouTube search on the Greek gift and acquaint yourself with the basic with the rudiments of the Greek gift sacrifice. It's not as common as it may be made out to be, but it's still a good tactical pattern to be aware of. Last thing I'll mention, if the king had darted up to g3, how would we have finished off the attack? There's many ways to do it. The simplest is just to go knight e3. And here I wouldn't even take the rook. I would just go rook g8 check. And let's say the king moves back. We can even just take the bishop. But there's also probably forced mate of some sort that you could find yourself. Many other winning moves. This is not forced. We could even just take the bishop here and bring the queen into the attack, setting up the threat of rook g8 mate, as well as bishop h3. So this is totally one-sided because white's pieces are all stuck. That's it. Next game. Let's get one more in. And we have white against Professor 1179. We can teach the professor a lesson, and we get a Glek system. Yes, we will get another Glek. Excellent. A6. Okay, so in and of itself, this is neither good nor bad. It's just a move. It doesn't really do anything. Remember that you're not really fearing b5. You don't need to play a4 here. That would be the wrong instinct because it would weaken the b4 square, and it would do more harm than good. So we just continue our development, bishop g2, and we await the big decision by black, which is, first of all, where are they going to bring out their dark squared bishop? There's our answer, bishop b4. So here, one important moment. If you're not experienced in the Glek, your instinct might be to play d3. But that's also incorrect because black is not actually threatening to win a pawn, especially in light of their previous move, but also because it doesn't actually win a pawn. We can simply castle. The important thing here is to recapture with the d pawn. Okay, our opponent very confidently captures the pawn. And what is the kind of standard tactical response that wins the pawn back immediately? Who can spot this? Who can tell me? So it's not queen d5, actually, fun fact, because after queen d5, the knight drops back to f6. This is what you might be used to from like the Ruy Lopez. But in this specific instance, the move I was talking about is knight takes e5. Opening up, discovering the attack on the knight. If you're a King's Indian player, this should be very familiar to you. Rook e1 is also possible, but it allows black to solidify the knight in the center with d5. Although here, again, maybe we can proceed with c4, but all of that is unnecessary when there exists a very straightforward and very powerful counterblow with knight takes e5. Now, here I wouldn't rush to recapture the bishop. There are some interesting in-between moves that we could play. We could even try to bring the queen up to d4. But for the sake of simplicity, let's just recapture. White is much better. Why is white better? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, we have the bishop pair. Second of all, black's king is still in the center. And third of all, we have just tremendous piece mobility. We can easily bring the queen up to h5. We can chase the knight away whenever we want to. And white is a very pleasant position here, but our opponent has handled it pretty well. d6 is a good move. So let's think about how we should proceed and maximize the initiative here. I think a lot of people might want to go queen h5 here, or f4, but you need to be very careful. Queen h5 is premature. I think black will respond with bishop g4, and that will force us to offer the queen trade. There's just no other squares. Maybe some of you want to play f4, chase away the knight. I'm also kind of ambivalent about that move. If you're playing f4, then you need to be absolutely sure that you have a clear follow-up in mind. And actually, the more I look at it, the more I like it. I do like the look of f4. Why am I cautious about this move? Because it does contain serious drawbacks. We are, not very significantly, but definitely weakening our king position somewhat. Although it really helps that black does not have a dark squared bishop. We're also potentially blunting the future of this dark squared bishop, although that is the important point. I think that if the knight had dropped back to d7, or definitely moved to the side, we would have pushed this pawn up to f5, reopening the bishop, and most importantly, preventing black's light squared bishop from coming out, for example, to h3, or g4. That was the idea. Knight c4 is a really bad move. First thing I notice is that this knight is incredibly loose and can be targeted in many different ways, but we want to maximize the attack on the knight. How do we do that? There's several good moves here, I think. Queen to d4 comes to mind. Pawn on g7 is also undefended. But I think there's an even better move, which some of you are pointing out, which is queen to e2. It looks a little bit more modest, but it might just win the game on the spot. Because we're attacking the knight, and the other thing we're doing is setting up a potentially devastating discover check against the king. We're threatening bishop takes b7, which will win the rook in the corner. And if black plays bishop to e6, this is another benefit of pushing this pawn up to f4. We can play f5. So knight b6 is kind of capitulation. We take b7, and we win the exchange. We don't win a full rook. We win the exchange because the knight will be able to recapture, but black is cooperating by offering us the queen trade. Be careful. Actually, wait a second. Can we try to finesse this a little bit? We can, but I wouldn't recommend it. I was thinking about playing bishop c6 check first, but it might work in this game, but black can actually just cover with the bishop d7, and what have we really gained from doing that? If we want to be super fancy, you could play the move rook e1, which is a nifty little subtle inclusion. It encourages black to trade on our own terms, right? So this is like the GM move. Simplify, we take back with check, and then we take the rook. If you're like 1300 or 1000, I would see this. It worked perfectly because black also blunders the bishop. But if you're watching this and you're a newer player, you should just take the queen and then take the rook and convert the extra exchange. I anticipated that this might happen. Now, you might get really excited and say, let's go f5, let's win the bishop. But remember that we haven't captured the rook yet. So order of operations, very important. We take the rook, and now we win the bishop with f5. And we're going to be a full rook ahead in the endgame. Take on e6. And the rest is just crossing your T's, dotting your I's. And black is also giving us the c6 pawn. So we'll take it. And our final step is going to be just get out the bishop. Put it on really any square, but I like f4. Because it's a protected square. And bring the rook into the game, try to trade rooks. That'll make the win a lot easier. Okay, black wants to play g5, but that doesn't concern us. We can proceed with our plan. Okay, king h7, trying to hide. We can go rook e7, but we can also start with rook e8. It really doesn't matter. It's largely a matter of taste. We can also push h4 and just try to restrict this king, eventually setting up the circumstances for a checkmate. Okay, let's go rook e8 for starters, and then we'll see. Classic idea, rook f5. And now, if we bring the other rook to e7, black is knight d5. So what I'm going to do is drop the bishop back to e3, targeting the knight, and eventually preparing to redeploy this bishop to d4. Now, if we play bishop d4 prematurely, black will push c5. So as you can see, it's actually not that easy to convert this cleanly. Let's go b3. Chase the knight away. Our ultimate goal here is to see if we can find a way to trade rooks. That's the big item on our to-do list. So knight e3 makes our job a lot easier. We just take back with the rook, and the rest is very, very easy. Now, again, there's many ways to win. The simplest is just to start picking off pawns and then eventually make another queen. Converting these types of positions efficiently is largely a muscle memory thing. Or if you do it enough times, you're just going to your hand is automatically going to reach for one of the correct moves. Hopefully our opponent resigns. Yeah, so notice what I'm doing. I'm just identifying weak pawns and then just capturing them. Why not? Let's take c4. I don't care about tripled pawns. That doesn't matter. We're up so many pieces, it's a complete moot point. Okay, and now rook f6. This is the end. We push our pawn. And yeah, d7. We make a queen. Of course, watching for stalemate. Rook d4. Rook f4. Queen d3. And rook f1 mate. There we go. Remember that the length of the conversion is a lot less important than how clean it is. So don't worry about trying to win this fast. Just make sure that you're not allowing any unnecessary counterplays. That was another simple game and another good advertisement for the Glek system at this level and really at any level. We encountered this move a6, which is not really It's not a main line. It's not a theoretical move. It's also not a terrible move if black continues by developing the bishop. So I'll remind you that previously we faced bishop c5, which is the most popular move. And the second main line, the most popular move at the higher levels, is d5, which leads to this early exchange. And then we fianchetto the bishop, and we get this very interesting typical Glek pawn structure. So this is the line that you should really focus on if you're a higher rated player trying to learn the Glek, and I'm sure we're going to face it many times. Bishop c5, bishop g2 already contains a pretty nasty trap. Black has to know the move d6 here, because if black starts by castling, does anybody remember how white already gets a nice opening advantage in this position? Like, you would think, just developing pieces, how bad can it be? And yet, that's the Glek system for you. Okay, let's see who can spot it. Yeah, knight takes c5. It's actually the center fork trick. And after d4, black has, as most of you should know, has only one way to basically maintain the bishop, which is to play bishop d6. And after de bishop e5, we castle. So we allow the move bishop takes c3. Again, in the Glek system, you very rarely are concerned about the queenside pawn structure. It's a lot more important to get the bishop pair and to get control of the dark squares. But if black plays the move d6, and I covered this, white has a really, really important resource that already gives a big advantage. So d6 is, it's about +1 after this subsequent inaccuracy. Does anybody know or remember the move? So it's not f4. I mean, a lot of you are probably thinking f4, but this allows bishop c3, and then black can start to harass this e4 pawn. Of course, the ideal scenario is if you can get f4 in and there's no bishop takes c3, you trap the bishop. So the correct move is prophylactic. It's knight back to e2. Yeah, knight e2. Very, very strong move, and you'll find that black has a very hard time defending against f4, which traps the bishop. The only real way to do it is to drop this their own knight back to d7, which blocks the bishop. But now you develop this very, very serious kingside initiative, f4 and g4. You're coming in with g5. The knight's going to drop around to g3 and then potentially to f5, and white is actually much better here. If black plays knight to e8 to control the g4 square, then you have f4, bishop f6, and you just go h3. And this knight is absolutely terrible. You're going to go g4 on the next move. So just a little bit of review. Bishop b4, which is essentially what our opponent played, is also a very legitimate line here, and our response is the same. We play bishop g2, and much like in the game, we are not fearing the early capture on e4 because we respond with knight takes e5. So let's get to the game. a6. We're basically playing this up a tempo because we've already castled, and black takes, and takes on e4. A quick note that if black does not take on e4, like let's say black gets cold feet and plays d6, what is the correct setup here for white? There's a couple of ways that we can play this, but I really like putting the queen on e2 in these types of positions. Let's say the black castles kingside, right? This is not a very forcing position, so it's hard to analyze. Here, I really like playing b3. And okay, let's say black plays something neutral like h6. The point is you're going to fianchetto your bishop, which looks really stupid at first, but then you're going to push your pawn up to c4, and you're going to get a really, really nice bind in the center. Eventually, you're going to be threatening c5. Actually, it's already a threat. So for instance, well, it's already a semi-threat, right? It's a positional idea to push c5 and try to break apart the pawn chain. It doesn't mean you need to play it immediately. You can improve your kingside position by playing h3, king h2, knight h4, but this bishop is very nicely situated on b2 because it also controls the d4 square. So I generally like to play queen e2 and then try to fianchetto. Okay, you're also never afraid of the move bishop g4 in the Glek because you can just push h3, and if the bishop drops back to h5, you can do many different things, but you can essentially ignore the bishop. And the computer in these types of positions actually likes moving the queen away in order to open the door for the move knight h4. And this bishop is basically caught with its pants down. It's not clear what is it doing on h5. Meanwhile, we're going to go knight f5, and we can continue carrying out this sequence of b3, bishop b2, and c4 with an eventual f4, of course. That's one of the main ideas of the Glek. But in the game, black plays knight takes e4, we respond with knight takes e5. And this, of course, is the typical tactic that you should be aware of. Okay, looking for any questions thus far. Yeah, why did I do d takes e3? So this is the typical recapture in the Glek. You very rarely will play bc. And the reason is because, okay, bc is fine, actually. You can play bc. There's nothing tactically wrong with this move. This is still going to work. But in short, dc increases your control over the center, right? The queen is happy, and your central control is going to be much superior. After bc, you're going to have this slightly awkward structure, although you do get this structure if black plays d5. So like here, you actually do play bc because dc makes no sense. It allows the queen trade. So yeah, you can play bc, but when possible, I like opening up the bishop and increasing our control over the center. It's a case-by-case basis type of thing. So one thing to remember is never to fear a move like knight takes f2. A desperado sacrifice for several reasons. Who can name one of them? What's the simplest reason that this fails? This fails for many, many reasons, actually. Yeah, not knight takes f7. What is the simplest refutation? The absolute most straightforward. It's knight takes c6. It's just knight takes c6. Okay, queen d3 blunders the queen. Queen f3 is very imprecise because I can just take your knight. Knight takes c6 wins a piece, and I'm a little bit surprised that people are not going for this intuitively, right? So if you understand this position logically, right, what's going on here? Well, the knight on e5 is hanging, and so is the knight on f2. So your instinct should be, can we get this knight on e5 somewhere with tempo? So knight f7 is an excellent move, but knight takes c6 simply captures a minor piece. If black takes the queen, you can give a check on e1, but you can also just take the queen. Black loses the piece. And if black recaptures the knight, then so do we, and again, we're up a piece. This type of thing is also prevalent in the King's Indian exchange variation, where, again, a slight detour just to give you some context. In the mainline King's Indian, if white plays the exchange variation, the move knight takes e5 is considered very unwise because of the exact same trick, knight takes e4. And much like in the Glek, if white plays knight takes f7, here you need to slightly modify the idea I just showed you, but the root of the idea is exactly the same. Black to play and win a piece easily. Black to play and win a piece. Bishop, yeah. So here, it's obviously not knight takes c3 because then you drop the rook, but you actually take the knight with a bishop, eliminating the attacker, and then you pick up f7. So, yeah. So this is a pretty prevalent concept. Some of you wanted to go queen d5 here, but yeah, knight f6, and you can't pick up the e5 pawn. So here we went f4, which I think is a pretty important move. And my idea, as I explained, is to push the pawn up to f5. So hopefully I explained it well. If black would have played knight d7, I was intending to push f5. And the tactical detail that you should keep in mind is if the knight reroutes to f6, we can go bishop g5. And if black pushes h6, we drop back to h4. And this is an important construction for you to remember because it's incredibly effective. Not only does the black bishop have a hard time finding a good spot, but black can really never get rid of the pin because of en passant. And if black moves the queen away, then obviously you have to suffer the consequences on the king side. This is just a complete disaster. So it's not clear how black gets out of this. And this is just an important idea to add to your collection. Of course, black doesn't have to play knight f6. Black can castle. But here we could even try to play f6 ourselves and open up the f file and play bishop g5. And this looks amazing because we're going to take the knight, and the king, I think, is just busto. So the tactical potential of the Glek is tremendous. And these ideas often seemingly come out of nowhere, but they're not actually coming out of nowhere because essentially all of our pieces are in some way aimed at the king side. So just keep that in mind. Last few points, bishop g4 is not scary. Our queen slides over to e1. So notice that because black is uncastled, they basically suffer the consequences. And yeah, against all other moves, we would push f5. Of course, knight c4 is just terrible, walking right into queen e2. And black loses a ton of material here. Knight b6, bishop b7, and here we threw in this nice little intermezzo rook e1. But there was no need to do that. We also could have just taken and won the game that way. But yeah, of course, our opponent blundered the bishop, and the rest I'll leave up to you. You can review this on your own. But the rest was just a matter of getting our bishop out, bringing our pieces in, trying to trade the rooks, finding the right spot for the bishop. If black would have played knight e5 here, I would have responded with rook to f1. So always be on the lookout for forks and sudden tricks, even if you're up a lot of material. Don't forget to cross the basics off your list. You should still check for threats. You should still remember that the game can turn around pretty quickly with an accidental blunder. And that's it. That's the game. Okay, guys, it's pretty late, so let's pause the speedrun for tonight. Thanks for watching. It's a pretty long stream, and I'll see you guys later.